A few weeks ago, Dazed Digital published an article asking, why do men no longer read novels? The article itself had no satisfying answers, but the question triggered a big discussion online, particularly on X, where everyone had a hot take. And as I was looking at this, I was thinking, men do read novels, but we don't read many of the novels published by the big five publishers. And a big reason for this, at least from my perspective as a man, is that the editors at those publishers don't know how to market to men, and the books are not written for men. And this product market mismatch is why, at least from their perspective, men aren't buying books. But men are buying books. I read a lot of novels, at least a novel a month for fun, not even counting the kind of reading that I do for work. And looking at my reading, I've noticed that over the years, I'm reading more and more independently published books and fewer books by the big publishers. Why? Because those big publishing books just don't appeal to me as a male reader. And most of the novels that I'm reading these days are by indie authors. So why is that? Why are men shifting what they're buying, and how do you write books and market books to men? We'll find out in this episode of Novel Marketing, the longest running book marketing podcast in the world. I'm Thomas Umstead Jr., CEO of Author Media, and this is the show for writers who want to make a living writing books worth talking about. And I should warn you, in this episode, we are going to assume that men and women are different. If you're the kind of person who thinks that men and women are the same, you're going to find the following conversation very triggering because I believe that men and women are different, not just physically, but also psychologically and even spiritually. And what they look for in a book is different. And if you're the kind of person who looks for an exception to disregard a general principle, then this episode is not for you. So feel free to skip. And I will say the best breakdown that I saw online during this conversation about how to write for men and why the current books are not resonating like they used to was a blogger who's also a comic book author, a publisher, and a game designer. Alexander Macris, welcome to the Novel Marketing Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
So the first thing I saw that you posted was a meme. It's a classic meme format of a guy with a gun shooting another guy in a chair. And the guy in the gun was traditional publishing, and the guy in the chair was science fiction and fantasy. And then he turns to the camera and he said, why do men not read books? So walk us through your thinking in creating that meme, and then we'll go deeper into the breakdown of men and fiction.
All right. Well, it was triggered by this article that you alluded to. Publishers Weekly actually retweeted it with their endorsement. It was, why don't straight men read novels, right? And so I thought to myself, was that true? I read novels. Plenty of my friends read novels. So like you, I know I had this. And so I kind of did like this little dive, and it turns out, wow, actually 80% of the book buying market is now women. And something like 45% of women read fiction for pleasure, but we're down to 30% for men. So there really is a gap.
I want to pause you real quick because those kinds of numbers come from BookScan. And
Sure.
BookScan has a huge hole in their data. And so what Alexander is saying is true, but it's not the whole truth because BookScan does not capture Kindle sales at all unless they're reported by the publisher. And so all indie Kindle sales are not captured. And so you get a distorted view of the market where it's all sales minus what indies are doing. And the indies in many categories are outselling the traditionally published authors. And so anytime you hear statistics about publishing, you have to always ask, where is this data coming from? Is it K-Lytics data, which is specifically Kindle data and often wildly different from BookScan? Or is it BookScan data? And BookScan gets its numbers from publishers and from major retailers, but not from Amazon's Kindle division. They do get Amazon paper book sales as far as I know, but not the Kindle sales. Amazon keeps that as a trade secret.
Well, in this case, the first data point was actually from a National Endowment for the Arts study where they interviewed women. So it's separately from, which is probably why you see that disparity, right? Because NEA finds 45% versus 30%, whereas BookScan finds 80% versus 20%. So the indies are making up the difference between those two numbers, between those two ratios.
It's not 50-50, right? We would expect it to
50-50.
be 50-50, and it's not.
Yeah. The Publishers Weekly, that article that they linked, they're like, masculinity is in crisis. Men feel the pressure to conform to be masculine. And their suggestion is that, writers need to like create a safe space where you can feel with no strings attached, the direct opposite of the manosphere. And, reading fiction leaves you feeling full. It's a stark contrast to self-improvement imperatives. Like all this nonsense, basically, that completely misses the point of what will actually motivate a man to read. So I got very triggered reading this article, and I first did a meme, and then the meme went viral, and I got all sorts of pushback from the usual suspects. So then I did a much longer rant about it that went even more viral.
And we'll link to that rant in the show notes because this is basically a blog post posted to X. But I want you to kind of break that down because in this post you say, here's what a story would look like written by a man for a man, and then here's what that same story would look like written by a woman. And so how is it different, right? Don't men and women just like the same kind of fiction?
No, they don't at all. I mean, there's so many differences. Men prefer action. They prefer information. They want to read about men. Women prefer to read about relationships. Interestingly enough, women care a lot less about whether the protagonist is male or female, especially as they get older. Men want adventure, horror, science fiction. Women, they want things like realistic fiction dealing with relationships and romance and realistic fiction dealing with real-world problems. Men are like, I have real-world problems. I don't need to read about real-world problems.
We have real-world problems at home. I read to escape all that.
Yeah. Well, the one that really I thought was very interesting is that, you go to these writer circles and they tell you, never do info dumps, right? You should show and you should apply. You should never do info dump. Meanwhile, if you interview men what they like to read about, they're like, oh, I really like to learn information as I read, right? So if you go back and you read the hard science fiction classics that men loved, your Heinleins and whatnot, like he'll have entire physics discussions about why they're all doomed to die because of the gravitational well that's affecting the spaceship. And men eat that up, and women are like, this is the worst book I've ever read.
I remember in high school, one of my favorite books was Jurassic Park. It was one of my first, quote, adult books to read.
Sure.
That book is packed full of chaos theory.
Yes.
At one point, Malcolm is like on the bed looking up at the skylight where the velociraptors are slowly chewing through the bars. And then for like the next 3 pages, he's explaining chaos theory and how it relates to the scene that they're in. Or I remember a buddy of mine talking to me for 20 minutes about how nuclear bombs were made and how they work from reading a Tom Clancy novel. I think it was A Clear and Present Danger. And there's like 30 pages in that book in detail describing how a nuclear bomb works. And for somebody in the 90s, it was very mysterious. How does a nuclear bomb work? How is a hydrogen bomb different from an atom bomb? What makes the boom so big? Why is it so much bigger than TNT? And for this book that was written by a man for men and sold really well, New York Times bestselling book, went into extreme detail explaining how to make a nuclear bomb. Now, don't worry, no nuclear secrets were given away because the real secret's the uranium. So it just assumes that you have weapons-grade uranium. But if you had weapons-grade uranium, you could take that Tom Clancy book and make your own nuclear bomb with just a little bit of engineering know-how.
So can I riff on what you just said, similar to how I did on Twitter? So imagine you're writing, a male writer writing for men, a female writer writing for women, and the scene is you have to deactivate the nuclear weapon, right, that they've just stumbled upon. The male book by the male writer is going to be, Jack Reacher studied the nuclear weapon. He'd been familiar with nuclear weapons since his time in the special forces when he learned the secrets of nuclear weapons. And then the author will then demonstrate that he's an expert in nuclear weapons. He'll discuss the origin, Oppenheimer, the Manhattan Project, the intricacies of how they're built, a detailed discussion of how one activates and deactivates them, the risk of fallout if they fail. And then it will turn back to a technical description of the man doing it and the tension, right? And then it'll be Reacher cut the red wire. Okay, same exact scene written by a woman for women will be Jane Reacher realized if she didn't cut the right wire, everyone would die. In her mind, she saw visuals, flashing, children burning, cities being destroyed. She thought of her mother, who she loved, who would never get to see her grandchildren because the bomb would go. And then at a certain point, and it'll be interrupted by her supportive male who'll be like, you've got this. I believe in you, right? And then she cut the red wire. It's totally different. And you see it if you actually read, like, particularly the Kindle books where they really lean into their audience. They really write to audience. Kindle books for women, Kindle books for men. It's like you're reading books written for an alien species.
One of the big personality differences between men and women, because this has been studied by social scientists for over a century, and one of the enduring differences is that men are more oriented towards things and women are more oriented towards people. Jordan Peterson writes about this extensively, and there's a lot of interesting observations. Like the more egalitarian a society becomes, it's like the Nordic countries, the more this tends to manifest itself in people's own choices in terms of the jobs that they take. So a very things-oriented job is like engineering. A very people-oriented job is like nursing. And the more egalitarian a country is, the more women you have in nursing as a percentage, not less, which is really fascinating. But it also affects your writing. And you'll notice this with the Marvel films, because the earlier Marvel films were very much into things, right? There was this sequence in the first Iron Man film where he spends like 10 whole minutes building his first Iron Man suit. In fact, the Iron Man movie is probably like multiple montages of building suits, right? By the end, the more modern Marvel films, which are more targeted at a female audience, all the suits just happen. It's kind of like magic, right? And it's no longer about the gadgets. It's no longer about the things. And instead, it's much more about the relational drama.
I'm so glad you brought up those studies, because I actually, just before I got online with you, I was refreshing myself on them. And, you know, they keep trying to disprove this gender equality paradox. And every time they do a study, they find it even stronger. The more egalitarian the society, the more the society has worked to liberate women, the more the women want to do really feminine things and the men want to do really masculine things.
Email me links to those studies and we can link to them in the blog version. Because this isn't us just spouting stuff. This is well researched. What is up with women is a question male scientists have been asking for a long time.
That's right. They still haven't cracked it. But yeah,
still
so
working on cracking the code.
But it's like you got the Stowett and Geary study in psychological science. You've got Charles and Bradley in American Journal of Sociology. You've got a recent one in Frontiers in Psychology. And they all find the same thing. And yet they still can't bring themselves to actually come out and say, maybe men and women have innate differences, right? They're always trying to explain it away. And that's what leads you to this really bad advice that the Publishers Weekly article gives, where basically their advice is that the problem is that men are ambitious and stoic and masculine, and to get them to read, we have to show them how that's wrong.
Trying to change someone into the kind of person who likes what you wrote is terrible marketing.
Terrible.
And when you see other people doing terrible marketing, or a whole industry doing terrible marketing, I want you to see this as a market opportunity, because when everyone is doing something wrong and you're the only one doing something right, or instead of saying right and wrong, say effective and ineffective, and everyone is using ineffective methods and you're the one person using effective methods, there's opportunity here to make a lot of money. And that's what we're seeing in certain male oriented genres in indie writing, right? Let's say lit RPG, where you would have a whole chapter that's nothing but numbers, right? The audiobook is nothing but strength is 14, charisma is 12, right? And it's very much about things, right?
Yes,
Even personal characteristics or things. And you have authors who are making hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars. If you were to rank authors in terms of money, these are some of the best paid authors in the world. And they're often authors, if you're a woman, maybe you've never heard of them. And if you're a man, you're like, wait, tell me about these books.
Yes.
They're doing very well in the market because they see this market mismatch and they're taking advantage of it. So before the marketing can work, you have to have the right kind of product, the kind of book that a man is like, yes, finally, a book for me. So we talked about the things versus people. One of the things I've noticed is men who read really like to read history, right? Like in the nonfiction space, there's a lot of nonfiction topics that sell really well to men. And as a reader of fantasy and science fiction, I want what I read to be grounded in history. I often kind of play a game. It's like, oh, which historical war is inspiring this historical battle?
Right.
Or which part of Rome? So let's be honest, for most of us, we think about Rome every day, which is a big surprise for a lot of women. They're like,
right.
Wait, you think about Rome every day? And I was like, when my wife asked me that, and she's like, Thomas, how often do you think about Rome? And I'm like, I don't know, 3 or 4 times a day. And she was dumbfounded. And I was like, how do you not think about Rome all the time?
Right, exactly. Yeah, I can speak to a little bit to what I've done. So my business, Autark, what we do is we create tabletop role-playing games, competitors to Dungeons and Dragons, and then we also publish graphic novels. And the graphic novels are set in the universe of the role-playing game. And when I set out to create my most recent role-playing game, which was Ascendant, which was my superhero role-playing game, and I said I'm going to build this whole comic book universe about it. And the role-playing game itself is based entirely on, it uses logarithmic math so that you can scale to any power level of superhero. And it's super crunchy, it's got tables, everything is quantized. And when I started to create this game, people said I was crazy because all of the big publishers are leaning into the female audience. And so the games are becoming more narrative-driven and story-focused and soft and fuzzy. And mine is very much like those lit RPGs you were referencing where everything is quantized. And you can say, American Eagle is capable of lifting exactly this amount and throwing it this distance at this speed, right? And boom, instant #1 bestseller on DriveThru RPG when I released it. You know, it had became my most successful Kickstarter to date, and then has now spawned 2 graphic novels. Likewise, my tabletop role-playing game, Adventure Conquer King System, people outside of the space laugh about it because it's so crunchy and it's got detailed economic systems. It's based on Rome, is the setting. It's set in fantasy Rome called the Aran Empire. It's heavily crunchy. The economics are robust. The military tactics are robust. You can play it as a war game on the table or play it as an RPG. All these things that are completely contrary to the narrative that's coming out of, say, Wizards of the Coast, which says, let's make the games easier to access and let's cut down on the crunchiness and let's focus on the story. I go the complete opposite direction. And I just had a $300,000 Kickstarter on the basis of that, right? So the advice that's being given is simply the wrong advice. And the advice that you're giving is the correct advice. You know, numbers, history, action, things, stats. That's what turns men on.
And fundamentally, if you're wanting to target women, there's ways to target women, and women will buy and read your books, and those approaches work for women. What doesn't work is when you try to take something for men and make it for women or vice versa. This is what Marvel has learned the hard way.
And Star Wars.
We're seeing their stats, and they were saying, wow, we have a lot more men watching our superhero movies than women. So let's make our movies more for women, right? More female characters, more female writers, more female kind of structuring of the story. And the results were that Marvel is now doing far worse because women didn't want that. Women don't want a female superhero story. They want a story written more for them, right? They want Bridgerton, which is nothing like Marvel. There's nothing, right? There's no mixing that, right? There's no taking a superhero and putting that superhero in the Bridgerton universe. Maybe there is. It might be a book opportunity, but it's not super resonant. A lot of authors are making the mistake of listening to advisors, their editors often, saying your book is too masculine. You can expand your audience by making it more feminine. And the result is just the opposite, because women don't want the male version of the thing but slightly female, and men want the version that they had before. They don't want the watered down version. And so this goes back to what I talked about knowing who your Timothy is. Alexander, you may not know this, but I use a metaphor often of the book of Timothy in the Bible was written for a specific guy, Timothy, or 1st and 2nd Timothy. And by being that specific, it makes the book more approachable, easier to understand.
Right.
You know, billions of people have read it. Very successful book, right? And if you look at a lot of the great works of fiction in history, they were often written for a specific reader, right? Christopher Tolkien was the target audience for The Hobbit, right? If J.R. Tolkien could thrill Christopher Tolkien, the book was a success. Now, by being that focused, by writing specifically for Christopher, who at the time was a young man, it now has thrilled my 5-year-old daughter. She just finished listening to the audiobook of The Hobbit, and she loved it, right? And this is what people don't realize, that if you can thrill one person, often there's millions more like them. But if there's no one person, if there's no named human being at the dead center of the target, there's no pond for the ripples to reach out to. But
great point. You know, the best example I know of an author going the wrong direction was this independent writer called Anthony Ryan, who I really like. He does fantasy novels. He wrote this novel called Blood Song, and it was about a very masculine hero who discovers his importance, overcomes adversity, you know, makes a difference. Great fantasy. So I was delighted to hear that he had been picked up by a publisher. He was going to have sequels. And the publisher immediately said, we got to reach more women. And so the second novel and the third novel basically takes away the hero's powers that he earned in the first novel and introduces the strong female protagonist. Third novel continues that. And they flopped. And so then Anthony Ryan went back, and so he started a new trilogy, and he went back to his original hero and gave him his powers back, and everyone thinks that's fantastic. Don't make that mistake if you're a writer. It's an easy mistake to make.
Yeah. Another difference is the difference between adversity and trauma. So books that resonate with men often involve a strong character who is facing a lot of adversity, often internal and external, and having to overcome that adversity.
Right.
Whereas the kind of strong female woman trope, which we're not really getting into how to write books for women, that's a different episode, and I suspect a different guest. But those kinds of stories often feature a woman who's basically perfect, but has been harmed by people outside of her. She's experienced some trauma, and she has to basically learn to let go of her trauma in order to kind of live in her truth and be strong, or what have you. I'm not doing a fair job here, but what I do want to say is don't do that if you're wanting to appeal to men, right? So men suffering, the characters suffering, and by their own strength overcoming that and not being defined by it is really important, right? Like Tony Stark doesn't whine about being in a cave with shards about to kill him, right? That doesn't haunt him for the rest of his narrative in the MCU because he overcomes the adversity. That's what makes him an appealing character. It doesn't haunt him because he's the winner, right? We want to read about winners, people who win and the other people lose.
That's right. That's right. Do you remember the 1984 movie by John Milius, Conan the Barbarian?
I've been reading the Conan original stories because Conan is entering the public domain soon, and I'm suspecting Conan is going to suddenly become a really big deal once anyone can write a Conan story. I think a couple of years away from public domain Conan, and it's going to be, I think, industry shaking.
Yes. So Conan the Barbarian, great movie. John Milius, one of the most masculine movies ever made. Opening is the Nietzsche quote, "That which does not kill us makes us stronger." Rousing Basil Polydorus soundtrack, bum, 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 bum. And then the opening scenes of the movie is Conan's family gets killed by the big bad Thulsa Doom. And the movie is about, and then he gets enslaved, put on the wheel of pain where has to push a heavy wheel his whole life, his whole childhood. Then when they see he's strong and survive that, he becomes a gladiator, has to overcome the adversity of these gladiatorial battles and the suffering. And then finally becomes a master of swordplay, makes his escape, and then he decides to get his revenge on Thulsa Doom. And at the very end of the movie, he confronts Thulsa Doom, who's played by James Earl Jones. And Thulsa Doom says, "I made you. I created you with the adversity that I inflicted upon you. Your strength is the strength I gave you." And if this movie were made in the modern day, what would happen is that probably Conan would say, "And now I'm bigger than you," and he would turn around and walk away, right? Or he would, tweak his nose or something like that, right? What happens in the 1984 movie is Conan just looks at him and cuts his head off. And then he sits down on the guy's on this temple of power with his arms crossed, and he watches as all of the guy's minions panic and realize that their hero, their lord, has been defeated, and they leave. And he just sits there in satisfaction at the victory. And that's it, right? Like, that's the male fantasy. And I remember being very disappointed at a certain point in my life when I realized that if I was now brutally traumatized by the death of everyone I loved, I was now too old to become an awesome warrior who could revenge them all, right?
That desire for strength, that desire for winning, for overcoming, right? I think that's what makes Conan such an appealing character, is that he's victorious, right? At the end of every story, he's victorious. And it's interesting reading these Conan stories because the original ones are almost a generation older than Lord of the Rings, right? So a generation before Frodo was fighting Shelob in this ancient ruins, right? The giant spider. Conan was fighting a giant spider in ancient ruins. One of the big differences is that Tolkien makes magic good occasionally, right? Gandalf is a wizard who does good magic, and he introduces non-human characters. So Conan lives in a world where magic is always evil. Civilization's almost always corrupt, and he has to, by his own manly strength and vigor, overcome evil and get away with the woman, right? And escape with the woman who invariably needs to be rescued. And there's something very ancient about that form of storytelling. Not that every story has to be Conan, and this is really important. But I do think that if you're wanting to write for men, your protagonist needs to become a winner in a way where the winning feels meaningful. It can't just be free, right? It can't be handing you a certificate. Congratulations, you're now a winner. It's like, that's not a meaningful winning. It has to be at great difficulty, and then the triumph is satisfying.
Right. And that desire for meaningful adversity, we saw that in Fight Club, the movie from the 90s, the sense of like, my adversity is I have to go to the office and shop at IKEA, and I want meaningful adversity. We see it today. It shows up a lot in post-apocalyptic fiction, where it always starts off with the normal world and the Monday job, and then everything goes to hell, and the man grows and rises to the occasion of dealing with, that apocalypse. Like, in some way, part of the male fantasy is actually being made to suffer so that you have the opportunity to achieve greatness, which is foreign, I think, to the sort of advice you get about writing for women.
And it's definitely foreign to the kind of book that you see at Barnes & Noble. My wife was just at Barnes & Noble last week, and she was rolling her eyes because there's not even anything for her. Right? The modern books that are out there, it's not just that they're not for men, it's also that they're not for conservatives. And I want to talk about politics a little bit in case the folks aren't triggered, right? There's been this interesting phenomenon where men and women are separating politically, which we have not really seen since we've been tracking political data with polling, where men and women are now significantly different where they land politically. And I'm not necessarily want to get into Republicans versus Democrats, but there is an element of politics that's now getting infused in a lot of modern fiction, whether it's identity politics or this whole idea of oppressor, oppressed, right? Kind of the neo-Marxism, where your virtue is equal to how oppressed you've been in the past. And I think that doesn't appeal to a lot of male readers, especially the male readers who would buy your book. Would be very eager because no one else is writing for them. They're looking for someone who doesn't whine about being oppressed, but instead overcomes adversity.
Right. The split in male-female politics, I think, has been really interesting because it gets to that fundamental difference between men and women that we alluded to earlier, right? Like, if you don't believe there's something fundamentally different about men and women psychologically and spiritually, then it becomes an inexplicable thing, and you can only assume, boys are being peer pressured by other boys and toxic masculinity to vote for Trump or whatnot, right? Like, you come up with these solutions. But actually, there's very good biological reasons where men are motivated to succeed and to excel all others in a way that women are not. If you look at history, something like 85% of the women who've ever been born were able to reproduce if they wanted to, but something like 20% of the men who've ever been born were able to reproduce. And from a biological perspective, men are the expendable sex, right? You can have one guy and he can reproduce with as many women as needed, but if your society doesn't have enough women, it will not reproduce itself. And this basic biological fact carries through into all elements of civilization and culture. And so deep in every guy is this belief, like, if I don't in some way excel, if I'm not in some way special, if I don't in some way overcome, then my paternity ends with me, my ancestry ends with me. Whereas women don't have that at all. And I think these are really deep, raw, vital instincts that have been massively suppressed. Particularly, they've been problematized and called toxic when they're expressed by men. And I think that's why we're seeing such poor performance by men in society in so many areas now. Why so much anger, the rise of the incel movement and the black pill, all of this is all related. And it directly ties into what you need to do to reach men as an audience when you write for them.
And it's based off of a very core biological fact. And that is that a baby can be born to a dead father, but a baby cannot be born to a dead mother.
Right.
So a man can get his wife pregnant and then go off to war, and he has been dead for 6 months in war, and his wife gives birth to his child. Right. That can't happen in the inverse, right? If the woman goes off pregnant to war and dies, after 6 months, the baby dies as well. In fact, Titus Livy writes about this in Roman history, and I have to take it back to Roman history. So
Absolutely.
The Romans in the Republican era, which is what Livy was writing about, had these problems of these barbarian invasions, right? These Gauls, every once in a while, the population of Gauls would swell and they just pour over the Alps at these big invasions. And the Romans would often win, right? They would have these really costly battles. Early they lost, but they never forgot. But there was this one time when the Gauls brought their women with them. And it was this, and I forget the name of the tribe, but it was a different tribe that they weren't used to interacting with. And they just showed up, and there's massive numbers of them. And they only had to fight this tribe once, because once they defeated all the men, they enslaved all the women, and the tribe went away. The tribe was gone. From the historical record, you have that one passage in Titus Livy, and now we just speculate who these people were because they are lost in the genetic stream, right? There's no knowing who they were, whereas the Germans or the Celts or the Gauls who didn't do that, who would send their men, or often their young men that were causing trouble at home. It's like, okay, go prove that you're something, go fight the Romans, and the ones who are successful can come back. Those are still there, right? They had descendants. And so there's this powerful kind of reward mechanism built into biology where if you want your genes to contribute to future generations, you have to have your genes contribute to future generations. And you can't do that if you don't reproduce.
Right. And we see that now when they do genetic studies. And so they'll look at a population group and they'll find that the X chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA is all descending from early Anatolian farmers, but all of the Y chromosome of the men is all coming from Indo-European steppe nomads. And so those are very deep instincts. Suppressed as they are, they remain available to the writer to tap, should he wish to.
And I suspect it's part of the reason why men find battle so interesting, right? So men really study battle. One of the responses to your viral tweet that I thought was really telling was you can tell if a woman or a man wrote the book by doing a search for the word flank. Because if a man wrote the book, you'll be using that word quite a bit in the battles, if this is the kind of book with battles in it. And battle tactics and battle discipline and battle culture, these are all things that men really study. And if you don't believe me, just ask your dad about World War II. And ask some specific question and tell him that you think the Sherman tank was a really good tank and see what he says.
Right.
Or a really bad tank. And he will give you, likely, if your dad is still alive, a breakdown of the Sherman tank and whether it was good tactically and strategically, because he's really studied this.
Yes.
Because most dads have.
Yes. I mean, I myself was a military history major at West Point. That's my thing. I loved it. Imagine my shock when I discovered you couldn't make a living as a military historian. And the strategist Edward Luttwak, who wrote the famous book Coup d'etat and the book on strategy, he's very active on Twitter now, is talking about the Russo-Ukraine war. Edward Luttwak says that peace studies as a whole and conflict studies in the West has completely failed because it starts from the premise that war is a disease that needs to be eradicated, which ignores the fact that for thousands of generations, a huge percentage of men have loved war and thought of it as the most noble profession that a masculine man could pursue. And he said, and until conflict studies, peace studies, war studies understands that, they will never really be able to actually understand what it is they're studying, which I thought was a really profound insight. So all of my work has very detailed battle mechanics in it, exactly like you said, you know. Yeah, I won't say my superhero stories have flanking, but they have the superhero equivalent of flanking, you know. Yeah.
Surprise attack and sneak attack. There's ways of working it out. And while obviously that word flank is kind of a cheat, and in certain eras it was perhaps more important than others. You know, for the ancient Greeks it was everything. Whereas for, say, Napoleon's square formations, not as significant, and the placement of the artillery is better. But you see how we're nerding out here and we're jumping from era to era? If you listen to men talk to each other, if you like go to a bar and you get some beers into them and you just listen to the men around the bar, if you don't drink, you get some iced tea, and you listen to, this is the kind of conversations that they're having, and they just expect this kind of knowledge where you can reference a Napoleonic square formation and keep going because people know what you're talking about. Not to say that all men are like super into history, but these kinds of men are really underserved in fiction right now. And by writing books that, and if you're nerdy, if you're, some of you listening right now, you're men, and you have been suppressing all of your nerdy bits. You've been editing it out. You've been listening to your female editors tell you to make the hero more in tune with his emotions and add more relational drama and to take out all of the Genoese crossbow strategies. It takes Sun Tzu out of the story, and it's just like, stop listening to that editor. That's not the editor you need to reach the reader you're trying to reach.
Absolutely. They actually found that in that, remember I mentioned that study from the Library of Science earlier? They found some really interesting things. So they asked 6 boys who actually were active readers, and they tried to figure out what made them different. And it turned out it was that they had gotten introduced into reading within boy interest areas, outer space, dinosaurs, and the initial books that they read provided them a lot of information, which then gave them social credit among other boys of their age, right? And so, in other words, masculinity, as those boys saw it, and reading were made compatible rather than incompatible. And that was a key point. And, women will be like, well, not all men can talk about Napoleonic squares. It's like, that's true, but I guarantee you, if they can't talk to you about Napoleonic battle tactics, they have very strong opinions upon the appropriate formation of football teams. Right?
Right. And this actually is really important because when you pick a Timothy, you're picking what that nerdy thing is. Because remember, men are more into things, women are more into people. It's a general observation, but you have to have something that you're really into that book really captures. And knowing who you're trying to reach changes everything because now you have permission to be a nerd on that thing.
Right. Right. So if you were writing a book about American football, imagine your protagonist is a quarterback. The male way to write it would be you actually describe the formations he's adopting and the tactics he's using to win, versus the female way to write it would be to talk about the emotion of being on the playing field and the reaction of the crowds and the stress of knowing that his mother is sick in the hospital and didn't come to see him at the game and, things like that. For every topic, there is the male nerd for that topic, basically. And all the advice I've ever gotten from writer circles and things like this has always been entirely wrong. You got to cut the info dumps, less action, more character development. Wrong.
What you're talking about, the young boys and getting into fiction, I will say that was exactly my experience. So I really struggled to read. I didn't really read well until I was 8 or 9 years old. In the sense of like being able to read without like sounding out each word.
Right.
And my very first books were the Boxcar Children books, right? Classic, kind of middle grade. But very quickly I got into G.A. Henty books, which in homeschool world, G.A. Henty is still one of the top selling authors. And these books were like a mechanism for teaching history. The plots were very simple. If you were to look at them right now, you'd be like, these are all the same plot. You've got this British boy who's, fighting with the Carthaginians against the Romans. The Romans were always the bad guys, right? So, and it was, each book would take place in a different time in history. And they were a really fun way to learn history. They were very masculine, very Victorian.
Right.
G.N.T. was the kind of the king of Victorian era, but he still outsells most authors today. Like his books have enduring appeal, even now that they're out of copyright, or maybe it's helped that they're out of copyright because you can read his books very cheaply now. But back when I was a kid, you had to get them on paper and you had to pay for them. But I read so many G.A. Henty books, and I would talk with my buddies because they were reading G.A. Henty books as well. And even the ones who were in private school and public school were reading Henty, and we would talk about the wars and we would talk about the battles. And it was my first introduction to the Carthaginians. It was my first introduction to the ancient Britons and my first introduction to the Jewish rebellion against the Romans, right? I knew what the Bible had to say about the Jews, but I didn't know what happened in Jerusalem other than Jesus' kind of warnings about, flee the city if you think it's going to happen. But the story in the Bible ends. So why do you flee the city? Well, I read the G.A. Henty book and I was like, wow, the Christians were wise to flee the city.
Yes.
Right? Don't run back to get your cloak, get out. The Romans are coming and it's not going to be good.
Yep.
I will say our fascination with the Romans does not endorse any of the activity or behaviors that the Romans did. It's often a warning of what to avoid. The Romans did a lot of evil. I want to be real clear to make that point.
Absolutely. So are you familiar with the theory that autism is essentially a hypermasculinization of the brain? Right?
I'm not.
So there's a theory that autism, as we understand it, is essentially hypermasculinity in the brain, which is why there's the massive obsession with quote-unquote things and the awkwardness with people, right? And you're like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. And one of the things that they found is that autism expresses really differently in men than it does in women, because autistic women tend to be higher functioning than autistic men, and often their autism isn't noticed. But what it turns out is that autistic women tend to have masculinized brains for women, so they have more masculine brains than your average woman. So my mother is autistic and my wife is autistic. And I was introduced to fiction by my mother, who, when I was a boy, she named me for Alexander the Great, and she used to read me the Iliad and the Mort d'Arthur, and eventually Lord of the Rings, until I was able to read them on my own. And so from a very young age, like, here's me being introduced to military history, and here's stories of Alexander the Great sleeping with the Iliad under his pillow because he was inspired by the greatness of Achilles and things. So I often think, you'll encounter women who say, oh, I really love military history and I love those sort of books. I wonder how many of those women are actually sort of these masculinized, autistic brained. Certainly, I know that my audience of readers, because I've actually polled it, the readers of my games, my game designs, we have a disproportionately large number of autists who really love the quantity and the things and the itemization and the quantization.
And the structural social interaction, right?
And the structured social interaction.
RPG game says the next 2 hours or 3 hours of social interaction will have very clear rules, very clear expectations. And if you struggle to pick up social cues, I imagine that's very relieving of like, oh, okay, I understand the nature of my relationship with the game master. I understand the nature of my relationship with my party members. And so it gives some comfort there. So that makes a lot of sense.
And so then I think to myself, I think every man is probably a little autistic about one thing in his life, whether it's grilling or World War II or football, right? Nerdy, whatever term you want to use. And I don't use this as a disparaging term. Like, as I said, my wife is autistic and we talk about it all the time. And she considers it a superpower that helps her relate to me better and things like that. But I've had that slung against my work, like, oh, you write for autists. And it's like, well, no, not really. It's just, I write very passionately about intricate, detailed things.
If we could sum up this episode with one phrase, it's okay to be a nerd, and that can make your book more appealing, not less appealing. I do want to talk a little bit about romance and how to handle those kinds of elements, because one of the things I've noticed is that as fantasy has shifted from a male-dominated genre to a female-dominated genre, if you were to believe the stereotypes of like, oh, men are only interested in one thing, you would think that those books would get less sexually charged, when in reality it's just the opposite. That's that as women are reading more fantasy and writing more fantasy, the adult content in those books has dramatically increased. And it's not to say that there isn't adult content in male-written fantasy, right? Game of Thrones very famously has a lot of that. But a lot of the kind of epic fantasy books really closes the door pretty quick. Even Conan, right? Conan the Barbarian, visually, right, you look at the covers of the stories, they're very scantily clad, right?
Yes.
But if you actually read the actual stories, that's not the focus, and the bedroom door closes real fast.
Yes.
In fact, often there's no bedroom, right? Because Conan is often spending far more time rescuing than he's doing anything else with the various female characters in his stories.
Yeah. I was recommended by my wife to read some Sarah J. Maas novels to really get an understanding of what fantasy fiction written for women is like. And those books are so steamy that I almost felt embarrassed to be reading them at certain points. And I had to put them down because the explicitness. And for comparison purposes, I decided to read the gore novels by John Norman. They're infamous for being these bondage and dominance, sexually charged novels. I'm into book 4 of the gore series, and there hasn't been a single sex scene. Right? They talk about the existence of sex on a philosophical level, but actual sex, door shuts. And I found that to be the case in Conan. It's the case if you read the Ian Fleming James Bond novels. For all that James Bond is this great lover, door shuts. It's just hint, illusion, and move on.
So this is why knowing your reader is so important. Because if you don't understand your reader, and if you're just buying in cultural stereotypes, you're like, oh, well, of course men would want more steamy scenes. That'll make it sell better. And if you're writing for a secular audience, like, why wouldn't they want that? It's like, you don't understand what the men are looking for in the story. They're wanting to feel that victory. They're wanting to feel that aha. They're wanting to feel like a winner, and they're wanting to experience the different life of the protagonist. There's a famous study that Lego did.
Yes.
To try to figure out why little girls weren't playing with Lego as much as little boys. So Lego has always been a really strong boy brand. And so they did a lot of studies observing children playing with toys just to watch, to see how they would play with the toy.
Right.
And when the little boy is holding Batman Lego, he would start talking like Batman. I'm Batman. And the little boy would become Batman and would start experiencing life as Batman, which was the appeal of playing with Batman. And when a little girl would play with the Batman Lego, the Batman would become the little girl. The Batman would start, having tea and going to the store and having relational drama with the other Lego girls. And it would basically be like a dollhouse. And this, if you look at like what girls look for, little girls in a doll, they want a doll that looks like them. Right? They want to be expressed. They want to be captured in the toy that they're playing with. Whereas my sons, they play with cars that look nothing like them, but they have voices and they talk to each other. Right? Like there's no desire to see themselves expressed in the toy. In fact, there's very much a desire to see anything but themselves expressed in the toy. They want to live a different life. And so representation is important if you're writing for women, but it's not important if you're trying to write for men. In fact, it may even be harmful because men aren't necessarily wanting to see themselves represented in the story. They're wanting to live some other kind of story.
Also, what those little girls did to Batman is what the female-led publishing industry as a whole has done to science fiction, fantasy, Star Wars, Marvel,
and to actual Batman in the case of DC Comics.
Actual Batman. Yeah, right? Like you no longer need to be Lego and studying boys and girls playing with toys. You can literally say what happens when you put all women in charge of Star Wars. And that's what happens, right? And look, I don't begrudge them. If you put me in charge of Lifetime movies, I guarantee you Lifetime movies would start becoming about World War II in Rome, right? It'd be like Lifetime of Caesar. But, so I don't begrudge people for making content that appeals to them and people like them. But I think we have to admit that that's what's happening.
And again, going back to Timothy, know who your reader is and focus on thrilling your reader. If you just do that, a lot of the marketing will take care of itself, because ultimately what sells a book after the initial 1,000 copies, 1,000 copies are on you with promotion. But after those 1,000 copies, and especially after 10,000 copies, the book's either going to rise or fall based off of word of mouth. And right now, the market for men reading male-oriented fiction is so low. Right, you go to Barnes & Noble, you may not find a single book like written by a manly man for manly men. And so just the act of doing that and doing it well is enough where it's remarkable. I've had Larry Correia on. He's one of the few authors who are doing this really well, and he is making millions of dollars, right?
Yes.
He's playing to that fantasy that every gun owner has when they buy their first shotgun, where they kind of wish that vampires were real and that vampires were evil, and that their family needed them to use their shotgun to fight the vampires, right? Or the zombies or whatever. And if that is a feeling that you've ever had, a Larry Correia novel is very satisfying.
Yes. Because it goes back to the point earlier about adversity, right? And men, they want to imagine the adversity, the bad things, so that they can overcome them, right? I want vampires to be real so I can kill them.
There's a famous, I think it's G.K. Chesterton quote, or it may be C.S. Lewis, about stories of dragons are true, not that dragons are true, but that dragons can be overcome.
That's right.
I feel like that's kind of the essence of fantasy. It's because when I'm feeling poor, I want to read about somebody who's rich. When I'm feeling powerless, I want to read about someone who becomes powerful. And the ultimate fantasy of a fantasy story is the story of someone who goes from not having power to having power and learning how to wield it well, right?
That's right.
Luke is a worthless farmer who is whining about going to a Tashi station.
Yes.
And by the end of the story, he is a sword-wielding superhero, right?
Yes.
And he has gained power and he's learned how to wield power, and then he continues to learn how to do that throughout the story. And
Conan becomes a king everywhere. It's always the same story.
That's right. And that's a story that's resonant with men. And so if you want to write stories that resonate with your readers. They need to be in tune with the music that's in their heart. So you need to listen to that music. And if you're a man, it means listening to the music that's already in your heart and not listening to the people who tell you that that music is wrong. And you can be a woman and write for men, right? That can work, but you have to listen to the music that's in men's hearts in order to do it, right? J.K. Rowling, I feel like, did this really well, right? Harry Potter starts off powerless, right? He's a loser. He's living under the stairs. And by the end, he is beating the bad guy. Not to spoil it, but every epic fantasy ends the same way.
Yep. I went to West Point initially as a young man. I had hoped I would become, a general, Patton or some such. But I ended up resigning from West Point because I wasn't doing very well physically there, right? Because you get graded on the physical, and I was struggling. I was top 5% academically and bottom 5% physically. And my own career counselor there said, look, you would be at the top of any career you had picked except for the military career because you just don't have the athletic skill to do it. So I kind of begrudgingly end up leaving West Point, and I kept my military history major. I went to Binghamton University. Then afterwards, I went to law school. And while I was in law school, I studied internet law. And I did my thesis paper for law school, my third year paper, on how the evolution of cyberspace and how the code of cyberspace is the law that governs cyberspace. I designed some games in my spare time, and then I went and started a video game company. And then, 2001 happens, the country goes to war, and all of my friends who stayed at West Point, suddenly they're going off to war. And I had this terrible crisis of I've failed as a man. I wasn't the masculine person I should have been. I didn't go to war. Instead, I have this weird skill set of military history, law, and game design. And this is a true story. Out of nowhere, I get a call from DARPA. And they're like, hi, Mr. McCrease, this is DARPA. And I'm like, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA? And they're like, yes, DARPA. We need you to come to the Pentagon for a project. And I'm like, for a project? And and it turns out that DARPA has decided that it needs to test a way to look for terrorist activity. And it decides the way it's going to do it is it's going to test its algorithms, its learning algorithms on massively multiplayer games. But they're concerned because they don't understand how massively multiplayer games are designed, and they're also concerned about the legal implications of the study. And so they go into their little database and they're like, who do we have that has military experience, a secret security clearance, a law degree, and is an expert in game design? And I'm the one dude. And so I get shipped over to the Pentagon, and I do my little thing, and it goes into a little tightly bundled compartment that no one hears about for 20 years. And finally, it got revealed that this study had taken place. That is the essence of the male fantasy, right? That one thing that you nerd about turns out to be the most important thing, and the helicopter lands and picks you up. And so you go be the hero. And it can be anything. It could be, Bob, you're the world's leader in understanding NFL strategy. And we've just discovered an alien race that thrives on a competitive space sports game, and you're the only one who can save the Earth from them. That's it. Find that one thing, that, as you say, that Timothy, that unique nerdy skill set, and double down. So that was my personal male power fantasy fulfillment.
I love that. There's actually a passage in the Bible that captures that. It's in the book of Proverbs. It says, do you see a man skilled in his work? He will stand before kings and not before obscure men. And my favorite commentary on that passage was when I was reading the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. Because Franklin reflects on that passage, and he accredits all of his success in life. Because Franklin, unlike any measure of success, super successful dude, right? You could take any one of his professions, and he was there with the greats, right? Top scientists, top diplomats, top politicians. But it was actually his work as a publisher and as an author that he credited with getting him audiences with kings. Because he's I've stood before many kings, and even had dinner with the king of Denmark. And he credited it to him being really good as a publisher, which was his first success, because it was his success as a publisher that led to his success as a scientist and his other successes. It's a great autobiography. Awesome. If you haven't written the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, you really should check it out. It's considered one of the great works of American literature, and I'd probably put it in the top 5 of 18th century American literature. And he lived that fantasy, right? Yep. Ultimately, he's there negotiating with kings. He's one of the few people to sign both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, right? He was old, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and he was ancient with the signing of the Constitution. But he was the one who saved the Constitution.
Yep.
Arguably, he's the great compromise was his creature. He was the guy who was able to get all the different factions that were at war with each other to get along. I could nerd out on this very quickly. But this is the point, right? Like, nerd out on something. It's okay to be weird, right? If all you have is a sling and a few smooth stones to battle giants, that may be all you need.
That's right.
In fact, it may be better than trying to put on Saul's armor that you're not familiar with and trying to be something other than what you are. And so be that weird author, write that weird book, and write it for the weird people who would love it. And in this, I think you'll find quite a bit of marketing success. If you want to hear more from Alexander, he's got some amazing thoughts when it comes to fiction and writing and the world. He exists all over, and we'll link to all of his things, but I specifically want to recommend his Substack. He's quite the popular blogger on Substack, and Substack as a format allows somebody who's a deep thinker to go deep, but also react to present day things. So it's a little bit more timely than a book, but far more deep than Twitter. I will link to his X account if you want to follow him on X. And for somebody who is wanting to write for men and they're feeling discouraged that it's just not clicking, what advice or encouragement would you have for that person?
I would say disregard everything that you're going to read online about how to write, because it's all written largely for a different audience than what you're trying to reach. Pick a topic that you're really, really passionate about. Make a character who's an expert in something that you're an expert about, that you feel really comfortable sharing information about. And don't be afraid to nerd out as you write.
Alexander Macrease, thank you so much for joining us today on the Novel Marketing Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Our featured patron today is J.S. Living, author of The Covenant of Blood. Elizabeth Bathory Tepps wants to find the mother that abandoned her. She wants to find her father's soul, and she wants to know why she blacks out from time to time. But getting what you want comes at a cost, and sometimes the cost of blood is too high. What would you do if someone granted your deepest desire for one tiny favor? Find out in The Covenant of Blood by J.S. Living. J.S. Living, thank you so much for being a patron of the Novel Marketing Podcast. Thank you for your support that helps keep this podcast on the air. I really appreciate it, and my family really appreciates it. Speaking of my family, there is still no baby 4. My wife is officially full term, and she has still not gone into labor. So it's any day now, and in fact, hopefully, by the time you hear this, we will have that little baby, but there's just no telling. The Novel Marketing Podcast is a production of authormedia.com. Our guest today was Alexander Macrease. Our producer is Lori Christine. The audio engineering is by William Umstadt. The blogification is by Shauna Lettler. And you can find that blog version along with links to everything we talked about today at authormedia.com/430. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. I am Thomas Umstadt Jr. saying thank you for listening and live long and prosper.